Hello everyone, I'm Amanda Watson. I'm the Assistant Dean of the Law Library, and I'm so happy to welcome you to this book talk for Aligning Election Law by Nicholas Stephanopoulos. You can get a print copy of this book from the Coop. They're right outside the door, or you can check it out from the library. I want to thank the Dean's Office for their general support of the Faculty Book Talk series, as well as our own librarians who come and make these events possible. Lisa Ryden, Deanna Barmakian, David Ginsberg, Caroline Walters, Teresa Knapp, Rachel Parker, and Maya Bergamesco. If you don't already have your phone silenced, please do so. So we're joined today by Nicholas Stephanopoulos and Ruth Greenwood. Nicholas is a Kirkland and Ellis Professor of Law here at HLS. His research and teaching interests include election law, constitutional law, administrative law, legislation, and comparative law. His work is particularly focused on the intersection of democratic theory, empirical political science, and the American electoral system. Ruth Greenwood is an assistant clinical professor of law and the director of the election law clinic at HLS. She engages in litigation and advocacy on a variety of election law cases while training the next generation of election lawyers. So I'll now turn it over to our speakers, and we'll have Q&A after just a little time. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Amanda. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. For anyone that doesn't know, we're married, in case that makes it awkward or not. It's better to know.
The Q&A might switch from the book to chores at home.
Yeah, exactly. What have you done to make our house cleaner today? Okay, so many of you I see have been students of Nick, and so you may know some of his ideas here, but as we're talking about the book, why don't we just start out by what do you mean by alignment?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ruth. Thanks to everybody for coming. It's really a pleasure to see you here. Yes, by alignment, I mean a pretty familiar concept in thinking about democracy, which is that the output of the government should correspond to what people want the government to do. This is a pretty intuitive value that lies at the core of many different conceptions of democracy. Just a bit more on variants of alignment. You can imagine alignment within a particular electoral district or within an entire jurisdiction, which might be a city, a state, or the country as a whole. And I think both of those forms of alignment are important. We can also think about alignment with respect to several different kinds of governmental outputs. So politicians have party affiliations. So we can think about partisan alignment between those party affiliations and the partisan preferences of voters. Elected officials take positions on public policy issues, quintessentially by voting on bills in the legislature. And so we can think about representational alignment between those policy stands and voters' policy preferences. And then most fundamentally, the government enacts policies. And so we can think about policy alignment between those adopted policies and voters' policy preferences. And I think all those forms of alignment are important. The most fundamental, in my view, is policy alignment at the level of the whole jurisdiction as opposed to the individual legislative district.
Okay, and how is this, well, it's conceptually different from a couple of other theories that I'm aware of in election law. So one is about the value of competition, right? If everything's competitive, that makes for a good set of election laws. Or participation, right? A lot of people are like, why can't people under 18 vote? What about non-citizens? What about non-voters? Wouldn't that change how our democracy functions, or if we change the election laws? How is this different?
Yeah, great. So with respect to any academic theory, one might ask, what is the contribution this is making? How is this novel relative to existing accounts within the field? And so within election law, even before the competition and participation accounts came about, the most common election law theory is that courts and scholars and others ought to focus on individual rights and balancing those rights to vote or to speak or to associate against countervailing governmental interests. So that's the theory still adopted by courts today. Over the last couple decades, election law scholars introduced some different theories, one of which focused on electoral competition as the ultimate value in election law. Competition has several meanings. The basic one is how close are elections? Are elections decided by narrow margins or by very large margins? And so Samus Sakharov and Rick Pildes have famously argued that the promotion of electoral competition ought to be the touchstone for courts and for policymakers in this area. And some other scholars, like Justice Breyer, for example, have really focused on participation. This can include voter turnout, but it can also include things like canvassing, phone banking, attending rallies, giving money, other non-voting forms of participation. So alignment is different because alignment is just a different value from competition or participation, right? Competition, again, refers above all to how close elections are, not to how congruent governmental outputs are with the will of the people. And then participation has to do with people's involvement in government, not, again, with the fit of governmental outcomes with popular preferences. One might think of both competition and participation as vehicles of getting more alignment. And so it's not like my approach has nothing in common with those earlier approaches. They might be means, two means among a whole set of means of promoting alignment in our system.
Okay, what inspired you to write the book? Obviously beyond me being an inspiration to you in everything election law.
Before we started the talk, Ruth was complaining that in the casebook that I edit, I don't only thank her, I also thank our children.
My thanks has been diluted by my kids.
Yeah.
And what do they do to contribute to the casebook? They take time away from it.
So beyond family, I was inspired to write the casebook. First off, so I'd written a bunch of articles about alignment 5 to 10 years ago. And I'd always felt that the alignment idea was sort of fragmented among different publications as a result. There was an initial article laying out the concept. There was another article trying to empirically measure alignment in American politics. And there was a third article zeroing in on alignment in the campaign finance context. And I kind of thought, who's going to go to the trouble of reading all these, different articles and their different passages on this idea? Better to unify it in a single place. And then secondarily, in other fields, it's pretty common for scholars to write books about their theories of the field. And so there are lots of books about constitutional law theories, administrative law theories, property, tort law theories. Sort of weirdly in election law, there's 0 to 2 books that have ever done this, depending on what you think about a couple of books a decade ago or so. So I also saw kind of an opportunity to develop a model of election law at book length in a way that scholars haven't previously done, and thereby, hopefully, to have a real influence on thinking within the field. In other areas that I'm familiar with, books have a lot of influence, and I don't see why the same shouldn't be true within election law.
I mean, one type of influence could just be everybody else that writes a book is explaining why you're wrong. So you're setting yourself up here. Okay, well, we sort of got the theory then. Let's talk about how you operationalize it. You mentioned writing an article about campaign finance and alignment, so I think it's helpful to understand the concept by seeing sort of what it means in practice. So what do you mean by alignment in the campaign finance context, and what laws would you change in campaign finance to get more alignment?
Yeah, great. And let me answer that, I guess, how I would tackle measuring alignment and assessing whether any set of policies improves or worsens alignment, and then I can talk about what we know about campaign finance law in particular. So since alignment refers to the fit between, let's say, governmental policies and people's preferences about those policies, ideally, you would have data about both of those two things, what people want policies to be and what policies actually are. You would ideally have that data on a time-variant basis. So, every year, what are policies that are in place and what are people's views about those policies? You would then look, okay, at what point did certain jurisdictions adopt policies that might be either aligning or misaligning? And once you have those sets of data, there are various standard empirical techniques for analyzing whether one of those policies in fact improved, worsened, or had no impact on the state of alignment. So I would tackle campaign finance policies in the same way that I would tackle any set of electoral policies or even non-electoral policies. So what do we know in the campaign finance context? This is kind of surprising to me. I wouldn't have anticipated that unchecked money in politics is one of the biggest drivers of misalignment in our system. And so therefore, certain campaign finance restrictions are among the most aligning regulations the government can pass.
Why is that surprising to you? I feel like whenever I ask one of our classes, what's wrong? They're like, money in politics, right? It's distorting everything. Isn't that intuitive?
I guess it's surprising to me because of all the evidence that campaign spending has little effect on election outcomes. And so it's surprising to me that money in politics appears to have little effect on voters in general elections, while having a big effect on the stances that politicians take. So the incredible evidence here is that if you look at the policy views of regular people, they tend to be kind of bell curve shaped. Most voters are relatively moderate in their policy preferences. Donors and spenders in the campaign finance world have extremely different views from the general public. They have sharply bimodal policy preferences. Most donors are quite liberal or quite conservative, and there are very few moderate donors. And then politicians' voting records, you might ask, do they resemble the preferences of ordinary voters or of donors? They turn out to be a perfect replica of the bimodal distribution of donors. So, this result holds up when you do the fancier empirical analyses that I talked about. But at a basic level, the reason, the most powerful proof of how misaligning money in politics is that donors get their preferences reflected perfectly among politicians, while ordinary voters have barely any resemblance between their ideological distribution and that of politicians. And note that this is not simply the affluent having influence. So there's a really recent paper that I read like a week ago distinguishing between the views of the rich and the views of donors, because most rich people are not donors. Almost all donors are rich, but most rich people are not donors. So once you disentangle those two sets of preferences, donors' views have an impact, and the views of the rich as such, like the views of rich non-donors, don't have much impact on politicians.
Again, this feels intuitive to me. Why do we not have better gun control laws in the country? It feels like people we know, we can assess them. They want one thing, and donors want something different, and donors get what they want. So can you talk about a different area of law? Like, what else is misaligning beyond money in politics?
Yeah, so I think the other probably best example of misaligning electoral rules have to do with redistricting and with partisan gerrymandering. So this is an area that Ruth and I have devoted much of our careers to.
Mostly unsuccessfully, don't forget that.
But for good reason, because unlike other electoral policies that people fixate on, partisan gerrymandering really has a large anti-democratic impact. And so I'm glad we haven't spent our careers on like voter registration or one person, one vote, or some aspects of the Voting Rights Act. They're not as aligning or misaligning as redistricting. The reason why partisan gerrymandering is so impactful is that partisan gerrymandering lets you take the same set of voters with the same partisan and ideological preferences. You draw one district configuration instead of another, and all of a sudden you've dramatically altered the partisan makeup of the legislature. And in modern American politics, Democratic legislators tend to be liberals, Republican legislators tend to be conservatives, and so changing the mix of Democrats and Republicans in a legislature has a huge effect on the ideological distribution of views within the legislature. And I'm not aware of any other policy in modern American politics that can take you from a 40% Democratic chamber to a 60% Democratic chamber while every voter still casts the same vote and has the same preferences, right? Like gerrymandering takes you from way too liberal outcomes if the Democrats gerrymander to way too conservative outcomes if the Republicans gerrymander. And that influence, that delta, is way, an order of magnitude larger than you get with voting policies, for example. So I think if there's one takeaway for current electoral rules, it's that money in politics and partisan gerrymandering matter more than any other electoral rules today.
Okay, but on partisan gerrymandering, I understand it at the state legislative level. That 40-60 example, I think, comes from Wisconsin, where we, have litigated for many years. And also in terms of campaign finance, right? Citizens United happened in the early 2010s. We were litigating in the mid-2010s. I appreciate that decade. There was probably a lot of misalignment. I think that the recent U.S. House results suggest not a lot of partisan bias, which may or may not be what you're talking about in terms of alignment. So sort of what is the current state of American politics in terms of alignment? Are you suggesting a huge shift, or are we going okay?
We're not going okay. In most respects, so in terms of most of the forms of alignment that I talked about, the current state of alignment in American politics is pretty poor. The U.S. House right now at the aggregate level is one of the bright spots. So the U.S. House had been highly biased in a Republican and conservative direction through the 2010s. Kind of remarkably, in the current cycle, Democratic gerrymanders basically offset Republican gerrymanders. And so in the aggregate, the U.S. House does not have currently a substantial partisan skew in either direction. Note that it still has the overly bimodal distribution that I talked about. So we have about the right numbers of Democrats and Republicans in the House, but the Democrats are more liberal and the Republicans are more conservative than the bulk of American voters. So there's still plenty of representational misalignment in the House, but not a partisan misalignment. But then looking a little beyond the U.S. House, in terms of policy misalignment, there's some really powerful data from Martin Gillens about a decade ago that on the typical issue on the federal policy agenda, a majority gets its way in terms of enacted policy only about 52-53% of the time. So there's barely more than a coin flip's odds that when the public wants something at the federal level, it's actually getting that. So I think that's pretty poor, right? Like barely more than random chance of having alignment in any given policy area. Things are a bit better at the state level. primarily because states don't have malapportioned senates, they don't have the electoral college, they don't have the filibuster, and so the institutions of state government tend to be better at capturing and conveying public sentiment. So Chris Warshaw and Devin Coey have a book finding something like 60% majoritarian alignment at the state level, even higher for issues that have been on the agenda for a while, as opposed to like recently emerging issues. They think that's great. You know, they see 60% majoritarian alignment, and they see the glass as being half full. That still seems, you know, half or 40% empty to me. Like, it's not that great again if 40% of the time majorities can't get what they want at the state level. So my overall takeaway is pretty negative, that we have pervasive policy misalignment, pervasive representational misalignment in favor of the extremes, and in many circumstances we also have partisan bias. You know, not at the US House today, but in many state legislatures we have extremely high levels of partisan skew. And so my overall takeaway is pretty negative, notwithstanding the happy note of the US House over the last couple of years.
You mentioned there that though there is sort of majoritarian alignment, there's representational misalignment. I wonder, do you really want it to be that the people's views are a bell curve and the representatives' votes are a bell curve? That's the ideal alignment for you? And if that is the case, don't you just want direct democracy? Everybody votes on everything all the time?
So there are the two big ways of measuring alignment. One's majoritarian, so relative to the median person in the distribution. The other approach is collective. Let's look at the whole distribution, not just the median, and let's compare the distribution for elected officials to the distribution for voters, and let's try to get the two distributions to mirror each other. Between the two, I think collective misalignment or collective alignment is more appealing. It's more demanding, but it also means that we're getting alignment with all points on the spectrum, not only with the point of the median. Does that mean I want direct democracy? I'm certainly more open to direct democracy than a lot of people. Even with direct democracy, I worry about agenda control, like who's deciding what voters are going to vote on. I worry about how voter initiatives are packaged or presented to people. But in principle, with certain safeguards in place, I am pretty favorably disposed to direct democracy. Even more so, I'm favorably disposed to proportional representation as an electoral system. So the whole point of PR is that it enables groups of voters at every point along the ideological spectrum to elect officials who are sympathetic to their views. So with PR, you can have Green Party and Libertarian and Communist and Fascist and Centrist representatives all together in the legislature. And that's how you get a legislature that looks like the electorate in its views. There is evidence that direct democracy is aligning, like John Matsusaka at USC has found that in a bunch of papers. But I think there's even better evidence that PR is aligning. That's the real kind of holy grail reform as far as I'm concerned.
Excellent. Speaking of proportional representation, a concept that Justice Kavanaugh loves, if this were the way, I'm in the clinic, here I am thinking of what things I'm going to litigate, if I am trying to litigate to get more alignment, and I say that explicitly, I think of this Supreme Court as pursuing ends-motivated reasoning and not being interested in more progressive people being elected. Just going to put it out there. So I worry that they wouldn't be interested in this. What do you think? Do you think there's a chance that the court would care about this? Does this fit with their theory of democracy, their theory of elections?
I have perfect faith in the Roberts Court being highly responsive to novel academic theories being pushed by ivory tower law professors. No, I think the current court would hate every bit of this. It involves a lot of change. It involves a fundamental critique of the status quo. It involves lots of data and empirical analysis, like outsourcing the ultimate results to what fancy regressions tell us about different policies. So every bit of this is designed, I think, to rub John Roberts the wrong way, and so I have precisely zero expectation that the current Supreme Court would be open to an alignment theory. The partisan gerrymandering cases that Ruth and I litigated in many ways were an alignment approach without that labeling, right? Like it was an effort to fight one particular kind of misalignment in our system, partisan misalignment attributable to partisan gerrymandering. And John Roberts hated everything about this. So we're not going to win Roberts' vote by using the term alignment instead of efficiency gap, or by saying, hey, look, like now we offer an approach that can invalidate all kinds of election laws, not only district maps. But to me, that's fine because, first of all, quite a few state courts are more receptive to these kinds of structural democratic approaches. Also, you don't need courts to do it. And if you look at American history, a lot of the most aligning actions ever were not the product of the courts. The Voting Rights Act, enfranchisement of women, of racial minorities, campaign finance reform. These are all things that Congress did, not things the Supreme Court did. And today, when I think about the list of highly aligning policies, again, for the most part, they're things the political process could do. They're not things you need the court to do. And a couple of years ago, in 2022, Congress came very close to passing an omnibus electoral reform bill that would have included a whole host of aligning provisions. So a curb on partisan gerrymandering using a quantitative bias threshold, public financing for elections, greater disclosure for elections, large numbers of enfranchising measures making it easier to vote. That bill came 2 votes away in the Senate from being approved. And that bill would have done more aligning work in one stroke than every Supreme Court case put together. So I'm not too worried ultimately that John Roberts doesn't like this theory. If Chuck Schumer likes this theory, that's a lot more important than John Roberts liking this theory.
Or the Chuck Schumer of 10, 20, 30 years in the future.
Yeah. If Chuck Schumer's grandson or granddaughter likes this theory, that's more important.
I think it's the last chapter, it's called Alignment Without Elections. And I think that is really fascinating and also invalidating of my work, and therefore I'm drawn to it. I wonder if you could explain that to get a sense of it's not just election law that deals with this question of alignment.
Yeah, so Ruth and I are both primarily election lawyers, election law scholars, and litigators. But one thing I realized in writing this book is that electoral policies are not the only drivers of alignment in our system. And so once we're thinking about alignment as a public law goal, we should be thinking about how to improve alignment through the whole spectrum of public law methods. So for a few examples that are kind of intuitive, I think, legislative procedure has a huge effect on alignment because legislative procedure affects what laws are passed, and what laws are passed is the ultimate determinant of policy alignment. So things like the committee system that's in place, whether there's the ability to circumvent the majority party's agenda control through not a recall petition. The House has some mechanism for this, I'm forgetting the name for it exactly.
I'm sure someone in the room was a staffer who made that happen. Continue.
The filibuster in the Senate, like these things shape what laws are passed. And so they're really important in determining whether we're going to have good or bad policy alignment. Then labor law turns out to be a big driver of alignment because in our system, unions are one of the only powerful mass membership organizations that are fighting for progressive and often popular policies and serving as a counterweight to corporations and wealthy individuals. And so there's really amazing data that when you limit unions, you get worse alignment at the state level. Where unions have greater membership and more influence, you get better alignment. And Ben Sachs here at the law school has written a number of papers on labor law that are really consistent with this way of thinking about unions as political and democratic actors. Last thing I'll mention is economic inequality writ large turns out to have a very tight relationship with legislative polarization. And legislative polarization, in the presence of no such polarization among people as a whole, is one of the big drivers of misalignment. And so I think that's pretty good evidence that if you used fiscal policies to reduce inequality, that would be good for its own sake, but it would also be good democratically because it would reduce levels of polarization and misalignment. So these are just meant as kind of initial forays into thinking about alignment outside the election law world. There could be other equally important policies out there, so I think we've only scratched the surface here. Yeah.
Great. If anybody needs to write a paper, I'm sure Nick's happy to supervise you on all these other ways that could or could not promote alignment. I guess aside from institutions then, are there any things that ordinary people, to the extent anyone in this building is ordinary, could be doing to improve the alignment of our political system?
Yeah, this was another surprise to me because I've thought about alignment as being largely the product of official state action. But it turns out there are some forms of private action that can make a meaningful difference. So one is just if everybody would contact their elected officials, that would help. So it turns out that elected officials are contacted by non-representative slices of the electorate, typically more extreme members of the electorate. And so politicians often misperceive what people want because they're only hearing from the ideological fringes, the sort of the extremist, loudmouth, busybodies who go and approach members of the legislature. So more representative contact with politicians could help. Kind of relatedly, so I just mentioned that politicians have really wrong, inaccurate views of public opinion on issue after issue. And most of those skews are in the direction of the extreme. So politicians often think that their constituents are much more left or right wing than they really are. And so one way to fix that might just be for private actors to make available better data to politicians about public opinion. And so Ruth and I are involved in a project called True Views. You should check it out, trueviews.org. True Views takes a bunch of academic surveys of the electorate, the whole US electorate. It uses this cool new political science method to then estimate public opinion on every policy within every level of geography. So you can put in your home address and find out what people in California or Iowa or Oklahoma or you name it at the level of the census tract, the county, the state legislative district, the school district, the congressional district, what people think about guns and healthcare and abortion and the environment and you name it. So the hope is this tool will catch on, and politicians will start to consult it and get accurate data about public opinion, as opposed to relying on their inaccurate perceptions based on their unrepresentative contact with voters. 538, though, the site, is hopefully going to work with TrueViews to use TrueViews data to analyze the alignment or misalignment of members of Congress's votes in the Trump era with what their constituents want. So if that comes to pass, it'll be like a really high-profile way of using the TrueViews data in kind of real time to assess representational alignment or misalignment, at least in Congress. So I'm very excited by that prospect. And notice that's all non-governmental, right? That's all entirely private activity.
Okay, so should we move to questions? I'm being given the sign.
Thank you both for sharing your insight. We are going to move to audience Q&A. If you have a question for our speakers, please raise your hands, and one of my colleagues will be coming around with a mic for your question. If you're joining us on Zoom, thank you so much for logging on. Please use the Q&A function on Zoom, and Debbie, my colleague, will ask on your behalf.
I've never taken moderator's privilege before, but I wonder what you think about using the Constitution, adding and amending to the Constitution. This is something Texas loves to do, right? To get an idea of what the people really want.
Yeah, in general, I really dislike that the US Constitution is as hard to amend as it is. I mean, I don't think constitutions should be as easy to change as ordinary laws. But the US is the single most difficult constitution to amend in the world. I don't think being the extreme outlier is the right approach either. And if we had easier, more frequent constitutional amendment, that might enable us to tackle constitutionally some of the problems that I've talked about. Revising the Senate, revising the Electoral College, eliminating the filibuster, getting certain pro-voter reforms. Like at the state level, many aligning policies are in state constitutions. And it's just because Article 5 is impossible that we don't conceive of similar strategies very often at the federal level. But in principle, I would love it if those strategies were feasible.
Yeah, I just want to add, when we went to watch Hamilton in Chicago, you've never heard someone clap louder than Nick at the line, so it needs amendments about the Constitution. Sorry, questions.
I'm just wondering, how do ballot initiatives play into some of the dynamics that you've been talking about?
Yeah, so sometimes very positively, when ballot initiatives are used to adopt electoral policies that politicians themselves would never adopt because they go against the politicians' interests in staying in office. So some good examples, like Michigan had a voter initiative like 6 or 7 years ago to adopt an independent redistricting commission with a strict prohibition on partisan gerrymandering. Of course, the sitting politicians who benefited from gerrymandering in Michigan would never in a million years have agreed to this. But the voter initiative circumvented the politicians and put into place like maybe the most aligning policy we can have in modern politics. So in that sense, I think they're great. I'm still a fan, but with more reservations when we have voter initiatives about generic non-electoral topics, about healthcare and welfare and gay rights and you name it. There I worry a bit that we don't want alignment at all costs all the time. So I'm generally supportive, but I still worry about certain abuses of minorities taking place through the initiative process. So I'm a fan, but not always a fan of voter initiatives.
So you talked a bit about how campaign finance regulation has resulted in a large portion of misalignment. I was curious as to, has that always historically been the case, or was there changes in that as a result of Citizens United and further degradation of campaign finance law around PACs and those sorts of independent contributions?
Yeah, so to my dismay, I don't control the research agenda of all political scientists, and so I can't point you to a study that has measured alignment over time and specifically looked at how those changes in alignment coincide with changes in campaign finance law. We can infer from various bits of information that the problem from campaign finance is getting worse, not better. Somewhat due to law and somewhat due to norms. So rich people used to donate a lot less money in our electoral system. If you look at the share of donations coming from the wealthiest 1%, it's much higher now than it was in like 1980. And so since those are rich, extreme donors typically, we might expect that as they account for more of the money in the system, we've gotten worse misalignment in their favor. Citizens United probably supercharged that. Like legally it wasn't necessary to anything because most of the misaligning money in our system is coming from individuals, not from corporations. And individuals could already spend whatever they wanted even before Citizens United. So Citizens United may have destroyed some of the norms against the Elon Musks of the world spending hundreds of millions of dollars in an election. But Elon Musk could have done that before Citizens United. There's been no point in American history at which somebody like Musk couldn't have done it. They just didn't do it, as a matter of fact, for a few decades in like the 80s and 90s.
Okay, we've got a question from from our webinar attendees. One asks, even if politicians had better info on what their constituents want, wouldn't they still pay more attention to what their donors want?
Yeah, they still would, but this would help, I think. There's a great, so far the only paper like this, but a really great paper out of New Mexico that Ruth has heard me talk about before. Some political scientists ran a survey of what voters in New Mexico thought about a big fiscal proposal that was pending in New Mexico. They then gave the results of that survey with district level opinion to half the politicians in the New Mexico legislature, but not the other half. And then they looked at how these politicians voted on that bill when the bill came up for a vote. And among the politicians who got the data on constituent opinion, there was really nice responsiveness in their voting to what their constituents thought. Among the other half, the control group that didn't get the information, there was no link whatsoever between constituent opinion and how likely each legislator was to vote for or against this proposal. So I think that politicians' behavior has a lot of drivers. Even if you fixed the voter determinant, that's not going to fix the skew resulting from pressure from donors. But it's going to help. It means that one potential channel of misalignment is instead becoming a channel for alignment, and that's beneficial. Like, I don't think there's any silver bullet, but I think that we should be looking for incremental aligning progress in a lot of different areas. Money in politics, donors, voters and information about voters, redistricting, the voting process itself, unions, you name it. I think we need kind of multi-pronged progress in all of these different areas.
I'm curious what you make of complexity as a driver of misalignment, meaning the way that decisions might be spread among a lot of bodies or among several different people, and that makes it difficult for voters to figure out who's responsible. In Chicago, transit is overseen by a board where the governor, the mayor, the county all appoint members. Schools are a mix of elected and mayor-appointed school board members. That seems to make it really difficult for a voter who doesn't want to read up on 500 units of government to decide who to vote for or against.
Yeah, totally agree. So one more channel of alignment that we haven't talked about is whether voters are correctly informed about who in the government is responsible for a given policy. So they can then vote on that basis, rewarding the elected officials if they like the policy, punishing the officials if they don't like the policy in the next election. And that voter behavior, right, voters voting on the basis of policies they like or policies they don't like is another driver of alignment. Now, you can mess up that channel if you make the government so complicated that voters can't figure out who in the government is responsible for a given policy. So I do agree that on balance, greater governmental complexity tends to foster less alignment, also less accountability on the part of politicians for the choices that they make. The unfortunate thing is that the American system of government is extremely complex. We have the separation of powers, so multiple branches, we have federalism, we have administrative agencies doing a lot of things. Then within the states, we have hyper-localism. Even at the local level, it's not just a single local unit, it's the mayor, the council, various kinds of boards. And so in many ways, the American system is among the worst possible that you can imagine in terms of too much complexity, confusing voters, blurring lines of accountability, preventing voters from using their votes effectively to reward or punish politicians for their actions. And so I guess the conclusion is that would push us in the direction of a more unitary system, one with less localism, one with less federalism. All of these characteristic American features tend to be problematic from an alignment and an accountability perspective.
Great, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for sharing your insight. Our next talk is Wednesday, February 12th at 12:30 for the American Journal of Law and Equality, and we will include discussions on Brown v. Board and SFFA versus the President and Fellows of Harvard College. So learn more and register on the library website, as well as taking a look at our other programming. There's still some lunches left if anybody needs one, and thank you again so much.